The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The World of the Sufi by Idries Shah. 4. Sufism in Eastern Religion. 4 Part 1. Indian Thought and the Sufis by Dr. Tara Chand. In this paper, I wish to examine the inner springs of our civilization, the ideas upon which it was founded, the goals toward which it moved, its world outlook. Now, culture is an extremely complex phenomenon. It has been defined as the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of human beings, transmitted from one generation to another. It has reference to innumerable relations which exist between individuals, groups, associations, and the social whole. It includes their manners, customs, and institutions, as well as thoughts, sentiments, and aspirations, expressed or unexpressed, held consciously or felt dimly, embodied in their systems of philosophy and religion, or uttered through their art, poetry, and music. It also embraces all material structures, all products of social or economic activity, all articles which satisfy human wants. Obviously, it is a task of great difficulty to extricate the essential principles of a civilization during a particular period of a people's history. When we realize that culture is a changeful phenomenon, that it is not uniform in all the strata of a society, and that it is composed of differing and sometimes contradictory strands, the immense complexity of the task becomes even more palpable. Change is in the nature of things. No society can remain static for any length of time. Evidently, every new generation brings into the old molds of society new temperaments, attitudes, and emphases, which sometimes gradually and sometimes rapidly alter the character of that civilization. Developments arise in the inner workings of a society as a result of changing moods of the individuals, modifications in the disposition of groups, variations in environment. Developments take place in response to the impact of external factors, immigration of ideas and artifacts in the wake of peaceful contacts or forceful intrusions. All these causes of change have operated in all societies. Yet a society may maintain for long periods the taste and flavor of its particular brand of civilization, accepting change in a measure which does not altogether alter its essential character. It also happens that the nature of the change is sometimes violent and revolutionary, resulting in the overthrow of the old and the appearance of an altogether different society and culture. The examples of the two kinds of change are numerous. In England, the changes which occurred after the Norman conquest are an illustration of the first type. On the other hand, the changes which resulted from the occupation of England by the Anglo-Saxons were of the second kind. In Greece, when the Ionians, Achaeans, and Dorians migrated southward and destroyed the ancient Mycenaean Minoan civilizations, the second type of change occurred. But the development of civilization from the settlement of the Hellenes in the peninsula till its occupation by the Gothic tribes did not alter the fundamental character of civilization. This happened in the 4th century AD as a consequence of the migrations of the Goths. In India, there was a continuity of cultural change which was brought about by internal developments like the spread of Jainism and Buddhism, the rise to power of the Mauryas, the Guptas, and the Rajput clans, the teachings of the great acharyas like Sankara and Ramanuja. But external impacts too exercised influences on society and culture. For example, the Iranian contact, the invasion of the Greeks, and later the rule of the Muslims. But none of these affected the basic principles of Indian culture. So that through the long vista of change spread over 3,000 years, it is possible to trace the fundamental identity of Indian culture. The reason appears to be that whatever was received from abroad was assimilated by India to her own genius. Where it failed to do so completely, as in the case of Islam, its failure was only partial, as there was rapprochement in a number of cultural features, and in some, complete fusion. From the earliest times, two trends are visible in the working of the Indian mind. One trend finds expression in the Vedas and the Brahmanas, and the other in the Upanishads. In one case, the gaze is turned outward. Man aspires for perfection in action, in worship of God to win his approval, in faith, in prayer, and in rites whereby one is sanctified. In the other, the aim is withdrawal from objective reality, abstraction from the outgoing tendencies of the mind, in order to realize the difference between the self that knows and the world that is known, in order that the self in its aloneness may be at one with itself, so that the not-self may cease to press, besiege, and imprison the mind. The two tendencies have been present in every epoch of our history. Sometimes the one, and at other times the other, has dominated. From time to time, attempts have been made to strike a compromise between them, but throughout there has been an endeavour to recognize the claims of the infinite, not forgetting to give what is due to the finite in the total scheme of things. It is interesting that in the Middle Ages the higher class, Apollonian in its attitude, was on the whole the follower of the path of ritualistic worship. The middle class preferred the way of the mystic, of Dionysian worship, and of self-abandonment. But the vast mass of people, unfortunately, was steeped in deep ignorance and crass superstition. Yet their weird forms of worship cast shadows upon the belief and conduct of the whole society. India, then, was not one people but many peoples. Each people formed a linguistic entity, possessing some faint consciousness of unity. But within each linguistic region there were religious groups and communities corresponding to similar groups and communities in other regions. But through the multiplicity of societies, groups, and communities, the same tendencies operated, so that Hindu societies of different regions, and Hindus and Muslims all over India, possessed similar attitudes and outlook. The spectrum of languages, religions, arts, and customs was suffused with a uniqueness which distinguished the cultures of India from other cultures of the world. Baba, who had the supercilious disregard of the conqueror for things Indian, and who was impressed only by the wealth and population of this vast country, was struck with the Hindustani way of India, which differed from the ways of life known to him in Central Asia and Afghanistan. In many ways, religion is the preserver of the cultural values of a people, and it most clearly indicates the character of their culture. Changes in the spirit, meaning, and outer forms of worship in a religion are signs of cultural change. Therefore, an examination of the religious situation is important for the understanding of the culture of the later Middle Ages. There were two main religions professed by the people of India, Hinduism and Islam. In both, we can distinguish the presence of the two tendencies mentioned before. The Hindus and the Muslims both had their traditionists, the orthodox who stuck to the letter of the law. They tried to conform to the injunctions of their sacred scriptures, to observe that which is commanded and abstain from that which is forbidden, vidi, nisheda, amar, nihi. They followed in their conduct the law as laid down by the lawgivers, dharma, shariat. For both, the laws comprehended not only the personal life of the individual, but his entire public life in social, economic, and political spheres. They believed that such a disciplined life led to the realization of the highest good, perfection here and eternal bliss hereafter. There were many sects and subdivisions among them, but whatever their differences, they agreed upon their emphasis regarding established doctrine and ritual. Then, both among the Hindus and the Muslims, there were groups of persons for whom the spirit of religion was more important than its letter. They laid stress upon inner discipline, upon the purification of mind, upon the disentanglement of the soul from the meshes of worldly attractions, upon unification with the divine. They looked upon the attainment of the ineffable vision as the true goal of all human endeavour. Salvation, moksha, najat, from pain and sorrow, liberation from bondage to the transient and the contingent. This was the right way, Supatha, Sirat-ul-Mustaqim. The traveller along this path has to pass through a number of stages, to undergo emotional crises, cultivate appropriate attitudes, apply severe restraints, and practice physiological and mental disciplines before he is able to reach the destination. The journey is for the strong of will and firm in faith. To this group belonged many orders and denominations. Although the approach of the followers of Hinduism and Islam belonging to the first group was similar, that similarity itself created a wide gulf between them. Each of them depended upon and derived inspiration from scriptures embodying widely differing religious experiences and attitudes. The Hindu sacred books were in Sanskrit, and those of the Muslims in Arabic. The pillars of orthodoxy were the learned of the two communities. Among the Hindus, learning was confined to the Brahmin caste, whose function was study and teaching. There was no positive rule regarding the acquisition of learning among the Muslims. But in India of the Middle Ages, the Sayyids had come to monopolize the study of the sacred law. Between the Pandits and Shastris on the one side, and the Maulavis and Ulama on the other, there was unfortunately little give and take. It is true that a few Muslim learned men acquired a knowledge of Sanskrit and a number of Sanskrit works were translated into Persian. Also that the Mughal emperors were enlightened patrons of Sanskrit scholars. Yet this knowledge remained confined to the few. Mention of some examples of each will not be out of place here. Of the Mussulmans who learned Sanskrit, Al-Biruni is the most celebrated. His Arabic work, Tariq al-Hind, is a compendium of Hindu sciences, philosophies, and religions. Abu Saleh bin Shuaib and Abu Hassan Ali Jili were the translators of the Mahabharata into Persian. Mullah Ahmad Kashmiri, who lived in the reign of Zayn al-Abidin, rendered the famous Rajatarangini of Kalhana into Persian. Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni, a narrow-minded theologian and a calumniator of Akbar, was entrusted by the emperor with the translating of the Mahabharata and Simhasana Dvatriyansat from Sanskrit. Masihi Panipati rendered Valmiki's Ramayana into Persian. Darashuko translated 50 Upanishads into Persian. His letter in Sanskrit addressed to Goswami Nrisimhaswamy shows his complete mastery of the language. It starts thus. Power which cannot be taken away or withstood, generosity, sweetness of words that have to be honoured in matters to be executed, that deserve to be borne on the head, that cannot be deceived in the world, that deserve to be swallowed by the gods, that cannot be pierced through by scholars, that are brothers to nectar. Bravery, majesty, heroism capable of discharging important duties, beauty, abundance of the highest dexterity, which has attained to blissfulness, and from which admixture of caste is taken away. Adroitness, may it be well with thee, who is the abode of crowds of virtues, beginning with these. Shayasta Khan, Dara's maternal uncle, too, was well versed in Sanskrit and composed verses in this language. Mirza Roshan Zamir died AD 1667, translated Parijataka, a book on music, from Sanskrit into Persian. Wali rendered Krishna Mirza's drama Prabodha Chandrodaya into Persian. In Bilgram, there were great Arab scholars like Mir Ghulam Ali Azad, who made a comparative study of Sanskrit Bhasha, Arabic and Persian rhetoric and ars poetica. Of the Sanskrit works which were translated into Persian, there is a long list, which includes the Atharva Veda, the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Bhagavata, the Bhagavad Gita, and a host of others, including books on medicine and astronomy. The patronage of Sanskrit scholars goes back to the Muslim monarchs of the pre-Mughal days. Bhanukara mentions Sher Shah in his verse, "Nothing is lost to us, the leaders of thought and wisdom and authors of innumerable works, if destructive criticism is hurled at a minor half-verse, or half of it composed by us, by malicious people who have not understood the real sense." Similarly, if among the millions of horses of Sher Shah, which in speed excel the wind, a few, 5 or 6, happen to be either one-eyed or lame, what does it matter? Govind Bhatta, who assumed the pen name of Kalidasa and added the adjective Akbariya to please the great emperor, refers to him in a verse as Jalala Kshonipala, or the protector of the earth. He describes Akbar thus: "You are a tiger in regard to your forearm, a fleshy, intoxicated elephant in regard to your shoulder, as regards your 2 arms a noble elephant, as regards voice a cloud, a lion in regard to your waist. Your sword blade is jet black like a braid, your mind is the ocean, your eyebrows the staff of death. O scion of the family of Humayun, it is true that you are more terrible than the terrible one, Yama." Then there was the celebrated Jagannatha Pandit Raja, who belonged to the reigns of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, on both of whom he has showered encomiums. He apostrophized Jahangir thus: "Why is your sacred thread black? On account of its contact with ink. Wherefrom has that come? From the waters of the Narbada. How did its water become collyrium? On account of its union with the rivers from all round, originating in the ceaseless flow of lac tears from beautiful ladies with long eyelashes, belonging to the hostile court of the wrathful King Nuruddin." Shah Jahan he compared with the Lord of the Universe in his well-known verse, "It is the Lord of Delhi or the Lord of the Universe who is capable of fulfilling desires. The other rulers are able to give either a vegetable or salt." He also composed the Asaf Vilas in honor of Asaf Khan, brother of Nur Jahan. Dara Shuko was taught Sanskrit by Kavindracharya, who helped him also in the translation of the Upanishads. Abdu Fazl gives a list of the learned men of Akbar's court, among whom 26 are Sanskrit scholars, 9 of them belonging to the first class, in their understanding and breadth of their views, who have received their spiritual power from the throne of His Majesty. Their names are Madhu Saraswati, Madhu Sudan, Narayan Ashrama, Hari Jisur, Damodar Bhatta, Ramtirtha, Nasimha, Paramendra, Aditya. Notwithstanding these efforts toward encouraging Sanskrit and spreading the knowledge of Hindu philosophy and religion among the Persian-knowing people, the unfortunate fact remains that the vast majority of the learned of both communities showed little appreciation of each other's thought. A heavy curtain continued to hang between the two, which did not permit them to come closer and exchange their views. Thus it was that, though both the Pandits and the Ulama lived in the same country, breathed the same air, and shared many things in common, particularly their spoken languages, their minds did not meet. So far as the Pandits were concerned, for them the world had hardly moved since the days when Sanskrit ceased to be the state language. The intervening 1,000 years hardly existed. They were held below the threshold of consciousness. The scholars were busy in chewing and rechewing the cud of ancient lore, writing subtly learned commentaries, excursuses, and annotations of the works of original authors, lawgivers, philosophers, scientists, and so on. In such a subject as the science of war, they were expounding even in the 18th century the tactics based on the use of bows and arrows, elephants, and chariots. They did not care to acquaint themselves with the knowledge of warfare which the Muslims had brought from outside, and disdained to pay any attention to their philosophy or theology or science. The Muslim state was an undeniable reality, otherwise the world of the strangers within the gates was nothing more than a shadow. The ulama's world, on the other hand, was not so abstract. A number of them were indeed foreigners or their descendants. They had no roots in the country, and for them India's past was a blank. They were unlike the Iranians, who had accepted the Muslim faith, but who had not broken with their past, which remained alive in their memories. It was thus natural in the circumstances for a Firdausi to sing of the exploits of Iran's ancient heroes, Sohrab and Rustum, and to take pride in their achievements in spite of the difference of religion. But no Firdausi arose among the Indian Muslims to sing of the glorious deeds of Asoka, Chandragupta, Vikramaditya, or Harsha. India was their home, but their spirit dwelled apart. The reason obviously was that all the Muslim ruling dynasties and most of their courtiers, officers, savants, and seers hailed from Central Asia or Iran. Again, although the Iranians were steeped in Islamic law and were in the front rank of Arabic scholarship, indeed they contributed more to the development of Arabic literature, Muslim theology, and philosophy than did the Arabs themselves, yet they never lost their identity and individuality. On the other hand, India's Muslim scholars and divines were just the camp followers of the Arab and Iranian thinkers and writers. They showed little independence of thought or courage to devise their own system of theology. In the circumstances, two streams of learning and thinking continued to flow parallel to each other. The differences between them were many and radical. Take, for example, their conception of God. Now, the Hindus from the Vedic age had been familiar with the idea of the oneness of God. The Vedic verse which gives expression to the idea is quite well known. The real is one, the learned speak of him in many ways. Yet this is a peculiar type of oneness, for it identifies such diverse gods as Agni, Indra, Varuna, and so on. It is not an exclusive unity, but a oneness which is the synthesis of the many. When in later times the Vedic gods receded into the background and Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva acquired prominence, the same tendency to identify them reappeared in the concept of Trimurti, the triune god. In spite of a certain friendly competition between the followers of Shiva and Vishnu, the images of both were installed in numerous temples, and the Harihara was the joint epithet for the combination. No embarrassment was felt, even in coupling a goddess with a god, and so the figure of the Ardhanarishvara did not seem to excite surprise. It was possible for an absolute monist like Shakara, who taught that besides Brahman nothing is real, to write beautiful hymns in praise of Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. Evidently the Hindu mind did not function in terms of limits, clear-cut distinctions, precisely defined concepts. Hence, the Hindu idea of God is of a reality which is both transcendent and immanent, outside the universe of existence and yet within it, beyond being and not being. The essence of this reality lies in indeterminateness. It is undifferentiated, abhishoma, all-pervading, sarvatravasta, pure, shuddha, known to man in the immediacy of the experience of self, Atma. On the other hand, Islam conceives of a God who cannot make any other God a sharer in his divinity. The Muslim creed is, "There is no God save Allah, La ilaha illa Allah." He is the one, the only reality, self-sufficient, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-encompassing, eternal. In relation to the universe, he is the absolute creator, sustainer, and destroyer, and in relation to man, he is compassionate and merciful, both loving, wudud, and reckoning, hasib, both generous, karim, and powerful, kahar. God is so exalted that human understanding is bewildered in trying to apprehend his nature. Men, therefore, should not trust their intellect and should accept what the Prophet has taught. It is an absurdity to employ reason on things divine. This rigorous assertion of the unity of God and his absolute transcendence, which the conservatives upheld, had serious consequences. Whoever associated other gods with the one God was regarded as a reprobate, mushrik, who in his own interest should be forced to abandon a doctrine which was likely to condemn him to eternal disgrace and suffering. In this form of belief, there is involved a determinateness of conception and a consciousness of unlimited distance between God, the Supreme Lord, and man, his abject slave. In the circumstances, the learned of the two groups did not show any inclination to come together. Each considered his religion, philosophy, and way of life to be determined by divine ordination revealed in the sacred books. This absolutist attitude could not admit of any compromise. I must, however, hasten to state that the ritualist, scripture-minded, literalist Pandit, and the dogmatic stickler for words, the assimilator, Mushabbiite Alim, were not the only representatives of their faiths in the India of the Mughals. There is no denying that the influence of the Pandits on the minds of the people in general, and of the upper-class Hindus in particular, was large. It is equally amply confirmed by history that the ulama exercised considerable power during the reigns of certain monarchs. Yet it would be untrue to facts to exaggerate their authority. Among both the communities, however, there were religious leaders of other views, common to whom was a less rigid adherence to the word of the sacred books and a more liberal interpretation of their meaning. Most of them had a mystic's approach to those important matters which concerned man's destiny, but some tried to reconcile religious law with mystic vision, and others subordinated law to knowledge in varying degrees. Again, some regarded the discipline of the mind as a means of enlightenment. Others considered ecstatic exaltation induced by emotional abandonment as an easy way to reach the goal. Hinduism can lay claim to a long and highly interesting history of mystic speculation and practice. In fact, the deep insight, the systematic exploration of the mental processes, the understanding of the conditions and methods of spiritual discipline, and the knowledge of the experiences of the different states of consciousness which the Indian mystical treatises show, is unequaled in the religious literature of the world. The story begins with the Upanishads, whose teachings have continued to inspire the religious life of the Indian people through the ages. From that perennial spring started a stream whose beneficence has not been limited to the peoples of India. The ideas and practices of Hindu mysticism of Vedanta spread east and west with the propagation of Buddhism and Hinduism in the distant countries of Asia and Europe. Islamic mysticism originated and grew in two regions of the Muslim world, ancient Khorasan in the east and Mesopotamia in the west. In both these regions, seekers of truth and enlightenment among the Muslims came into close contact with Indian mystics. All Khorasan was studded with Buddhist monasteries and Hindu temples at the time of the Muslim conquest, as is testified by Huyen Xiang, who had passed through these lands barely 70 years earlier. In Mesopotamia, Jundashapur, Damascus, and Baghdad were centers of learning where Hindu scholars taught Indian sciences, and Hindu ascetics, or yogis, had debates with Muslim scholars. The Pramukhas of the Nava Vihara of Transoxiana became the prime ministers, Baramakas, of the Abbasid caliphs, and they invited Hindu doctors, astronomers, and scientists to Baghdad and encouraged the translation of Sanskrit treatises into Arabic. Thus it was that the philosophy of pantheism and the practical discipline of yoga passed into the Sufi circles of the Middle East. No doubt the current of tasawwuf was fed by another source too, namely the Neoplatonism of Egypt, but it must not be forgotten that the theosophistic thought of Egypt, which was developed by such thinkers as Plotinus, Porphyry, Philostratus, and others, owes not a little to the Hindu colony which flourished there till the beginning of the 3rd century, when Caracalla, the Roman emperor, wiped them out. It was, perhaps, this foreign element in tasawwuf which was partly responsible for the opposition it encountered from the orthodox. In any case, obstruction and persecution could not stop its onward course. Its martyrs' list is long, but their blood became the seed of a widespread fellowship. The impact of Islam on India was disturbing, especially because in the early days of the Muslim advent, Hindu religious life was confused. Buddhism was in decline, sectarianism was spreading, antinomian cults and deadening ritual were sapping the vitality of society. Krishna Misra, of the court of the Chandela King Kirtivarman, has drawn a picture of the religious situation in the 11th century in his drama Prabodha Chandrodaya. He shows how the unholy alliance of corrupt and degraded Buddhist and Jaina monks, depraved Charvaka materialists, unscrupulous Mimamsakas, and immoral Kapalikas, flourishing under the regime of falsehood and vice, oppressed truth and virtue. The movement of bhakti, love and devotion, began in the south and extended over the whole country. Ramanuja was the pioneer. He was succeeded by Madhvacharya, Vishnuswami, Nimbaka, and Vallabhachara, who interpreted the doctrines of Vedanta from their distinct standpoints and founded sects of their own. As they wrote their works in Sanskrit, their direct disciples were largely among the educated who belonged to the upper class. But along with them marched a goodly company of saintly men who addressed themselves to the common people. They spoke the common people's dialects and in the main imparted their message through word of mouth. Many of them were endowed with the gift of poetry, and their homely, memorable verse went direct into the heart of their listeners. Their avoidance of learned jargon, their simple teaching stressing the love of God and of man, their denunciation of idolatry and caste, of hypocrisy, inequality, and the externalia of religion, their sincerity, purity, and dedicated life appealed to wide circles among the masses. Their utterances gave shape to the modern Indian languages. Their enthusiasm stirred the springs of life and moved men to high endeavour and unselfish behaviour. There is a strange exaltation in society in every region during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, which cannot be accounted for without taking into consideration this sudden outburst of spiritual energy. These centuries are filled with voices, at once warning and encouraging, of truly noble and large-hearted men in surprisingly large numbers. Yet most of them were of humble origin, and they destroyed the myth of aristocracy based on birth. The spirit of bhakti moved across the country from one end to the others. As Priyadas points out in his Bhaktira Sabodini, the tree of bhakti was once but a sapling, now it hath climbed to the sky with its glory spread over the earth, once but a feeble thing, now contentedly sways the mighty elephants of the passions. The men and women who propagated the movement of bhakti may be divided into two groups. One group was the advocate of a devotional faith centered on a personal god, Rama or Krishna. The other selected for their object of adoration the Absolute, which is impersonal, is without attributes, without form or color, beyond time and space. The first group was affiliated to the sect established by Ramanuja, the Sri Sampradaya, and was divided into two schools, the Tengalai, or the southern school, and the Vadgalai, or the northern school. This bifurcation took place in the 15th century, when Pillai Lokacharya and Manavala Mahamuni started teaching in Tamil, gave up Sanskrit, and took Nalayiram as their scripture. Ramananda, who belonged to the Sri Sampradaya, came to the north, and his teachings became the source of inspiration for the devotees of Rama on one side and of Nirakara Niranjana on the other. The first had their greatest exponent in Tulasidas, whose Ramcharit Manas is the Bible of Ram Bhakti. Madhva, Nimbaka, and Vallabha were all devotees of Krishna. Vallabha settled down in Gokul, and under his inspiration the worship of Krishna spread in northern India. His son's disciples were the Ashtakap, or the 8 seals, among whom Surdas was the most eminent. Tulasi and Sur are the two most brilliant stars of Hindi literature. Their works contain some of the finest poetry that India has produced, valuable from the point of view of art, and prized as inspiring and elevating hymnology. Not even the briefest account of these movements can leave out the name of Chaitanya, the Krishna-intoxicated devotee who thrilled northern India with his exciting appeal to tender emotions. He roused the passionate love of God through congregational hymn singing, kirtana, to the accompaniment of musical instruments and dancing. His new methods of worship spread the cult through Bengal like wildfire. It was in these schools of Rama and Krishna Bhakti that the doctrines of mystic practices were developed. The differentiation of the stages of progress towards unification with God and of the emotions which accompanied them, and the causes that excited and enhanced the emotional states and the psychic conditions which followed them, were expounded. The 5 stages, or bhavas, were resignation, prashanta, obedience, dasya, friendship, sakhya, tenderness, vatsalya, and love, rati. The 2 vibhavas, developing conditions, were alambana and udipana, creation and stimulation. The anubhavas, or psychic conditions, included the feelings excited by the bhavas and their expression. The process of training in devotion implied worship for the Adorable One, sorrow for one's sins, doubt of all objects other than He, celebration of His praise, living for His sake, assigning everything to Him, resignation to His will, seeing Him in all things, renouncing anger, envy, greed, and impure thoughts. These states, emotions, and processes bear comparison with what the Muslim Sufis taught in regard to hal and maqam, states of rapture and stages of ecstasy. For instance, Abu Nasr al-Sarraj, the author of the oldest treatise on Sufism, recounts the 7 stages thus: 1. Repentance, 2. Abstinence, 3. Renunciation, 4. Poverty, 5. Patience, 6. Trust in God, and 7. Satisfaction. And the 10 psychic states, namely 1. Meditation, 2. Nearness to God, 3. Love, 4. Fear, 5. Hope, 6. Longing, 7. Intimacy, 8. Tranquility, 9. Contemplation, and 10. Certainty. Apart from the founders of the 4 Sampradayas, Ramanuja, Madhva, Vishnuswami, and Nimbaditya, who composed their religious treatises in Sanskrit, and the propagators of Vishnuite Bhakti of the schools of Rama and Krishna, who appealed to the conservative-minded among the general public, there was the third group of mystics who employed the language of the people to preach their radical creeds. They mostly belonged to the lower castes, and their movement represents the urge of the unprivileged masses to uplift themselves. Some of them were persecuted by governments, some incurred social opprobrium, and others were not regarded as worthy of notice. But they were held in high esteem among the humbler classes who followed their simple teachings with eagerness and understanding. They laid stress upon the dignity of man, for they taught that every individual would reach the highest goal of human life by his own effort. They rejected the claim to special sanctity of priests, pandits and Maulavis, of books, scriptures of Hindus and Muslims, of temples and pilgrimages, of rites and ceremonies, and encouraged the establishment of direct relation between man and God. The movement arose in the 15th century and continued till the middle of the 17th, but then it declined and gradually lost its momentum. The leaders of this group hailed from all parts of India, but their teachings manifest distinct influences of Islam on their beliefs. In the Hindi-speaking region, the most notable reformer was Kabir, who was a most powerful exponent of devotional faith centered in an impersonal, transcendental God, and a most fearless denunciator of Hindu and Muslim hypocritical and superstitious practices. Love of God and man was his religion, and he accepted whatever he thought true in Hinduism and Islam. There were a number of teachers whose point of view was similar to that of Kabir, and who founded their orders in different parts of the country. Among them were Malukdas, Dadu Dayal, Verban, Pranath, Babalal, and others. In the Punjab, Guru Nanak founded the Sikh religion, which was nourished by his 9 successors. The last of them, Guru Gobind Singh, transformed Sikhism into a military mission. In Maharashtra, Namdeo, Eknath, Tukaram, and Ramdas were noted saints who were hostile to idol worship, indifferent towards external acts of religion such as vows, fasts, austerities, pilgrimages, and so on. They worshipped Vithal, the one God who conferred tranquility, and prayed for release from the snares of the illusory world. They condemned caste distinctions and sought to reconcile Hindu and Muslim faiths. Bengal had the good fortune to produce Chaitanya, who was a devotee of Krishna but at the same time opposed the Brahmanical system of ritualism and caste. Among his disciples was Thakur Haridas, a Muslim. But there were sects in Bengal which went far beyond Chaitanya in their criticism of Hindu orthodoxy, for example, the Kartabajas. The Veera Saivas, or Lingayats, of the Kannada Desha, were a sect which came into existence in the 12th century, but rapidly spread in Mysore and the neighbouring districts. Their belief in one God who cannot be represented by images or propitiated by sacrifices, and their rejection of caste, show their independence from the conservative religious ways. The Lingayats hold that love is the first creation of God, and faithful devotion the means of attaining the goal of human life, which implies sharing the joys of blissful union with God and recognizing Him in one's own self and in everything else. They did not approve of sacrifices, fasts, feasts, and pilgrimages, nor recognize distinctions based on birth. A pariah and a Brahmin were equal as members of the sect. All men are holy in proportion as they are temples of the Great Spirit. The teachings of the Lingayats seem to have inspired Chakradhar, who lived in the 13th century. He founded the Manbao sect, which spread heterodox doctrines among the Marathi-speaking people. In the deep south, the Tamil Siddhas, whom their latter-day detractors hold up to execration, were theists, the goal of whose search was the eternal light which they worshipped by the name of Siva, but they rejected the theory of transmigration and the authority of the Shastras. They held that God and love are the same, and desired mankind to live in peace, considering love as God. This brief description shows how a powerful religious impulse, which drew its inspiration from Hindu as well as Muslim sources, spread all over India and sought to bring together the masses into communion of a faith which transcended social, intellectual, and communal barriers. Rising above empty formalism and narrow ritualism, it drew the hearts of men toward a pure life and loving fellowship of the human and the divine. The stirring in the Hindu society had its parallel in the Muslim community. We have seen that Sufism, even before its arrival in India, had absorbed the main features of Vedanta, for instance the philosophy of absolute monism. The Indian Advaita had become the Muslim Wahdat al-Wujud. If the Vedantist asserts Soham Azmi, the Sufi exclaims Anal-Haq, I am he, I am the truth. In the Upanishads, the divine reality is spoken of as Jyotisham Jyoti, and in the terminology of Tasawwuf as Nurun ala Nur, the light of lights. God is both being and not being, Sad and Asad, and Attar says, "O, thy manifestation is as much as thy non-appearance." He is indescribable, neti, neti, not this, not this. And Maghribi asks, but then who is he? Who is this also and that also? The Bhagavad Gita calls him Vetasi Vedacha, knower and known, and Attar says, he is himself his own seer and his own seen. He is himself the show and himself the show maker. But the Absolute is unknowable through human eyes. Says Rumi, he cannot be perceived by signs nor by eyes, nor does anyone have his knowledge or indication. And the Upanishads call him Anirvachaniya, where neither eye goes, nor speech, nor mind. The universe is his revelation. The Veda says, Ekam Veda Vibhabuya Sarvam, and the Gita, Tvaya Tatam Vishvam Ananta Rupam. The Sufi renders the idea thus: whatever you see of non-living and living, of beasts and birds and all creatures, all this is the essence of pure God, who makes this manifestation in these ways. If according to Shankara the world is Maya, unreal, Rumi is of the same view. Says he, we and all our existences are non-entities. Thou art the absolute being whose appearance is transitory. And again, thou showed the pleasure of existence to the non-existent. Thou had made non-existent thy lover. In Hindu philosophy, the identity of the Self and the Supreme is asserted. Atma is Paramatma, Atma Vibrahma. Similarly, in Tasawwuf, there is unity without condition and without measure between the Lord of men and the soul of men. Man is truly light, Manomayoyam Pursha Basatyam. Rumi says, soul is likewise light, man's soul is like the sun. Then the creation of the universe and of man are explained in terms of emanation in both mystic systems. For the Hindu, Brahman is the supreme and absolute reality which is the necessary ground and substratum of all being. By its free choice, it becomes the creating principle, a capacity for appearance, a possibility of duality. The next step is the immanence of the creating principle in the world, which finally appears in the multiplicity of the universe, the meeting place of the real and the unreal, of the soul and the body. Ibn al-Arabi, the great master of Islamic mysticism, affirms that God is one and the universe is his appearance. Creation is a process of emanation of which the three steps are 1. the stage of absolute unity, ahdiyat. 2. The stage of latent or potential multiplicity, wahdat. And 3. The stage of apparent or actual multiplicity, wahidiyat. The multiplicity expresses itself in souls, ruh, forms, mithal, and bodies, jism. The soul, which is in essence one with the divine reality, forgets its nature in association with the unreal world. It becomes hidden behind veils. In order that it may know the self, the veils must be removed. The removal involves a discipline, a journey from self to self. The stages of the journey are 4. They are indicated by the words Jagrata, waking, Swapna, sleep, Sushupti, dreamless sleep, and Turiya, the 4th state, also by the terms Vaisvanara, Chaijasa, Prajna, and Chaturtha. The Muslim mystic gives these stages the names Nasut, Jabrut, Malakut, and Lahut. For both, there is a common discipline. It includes purification of self, mastering of passions and desires, filling of the mind exclusively with the thought of God, obtaining control over bodily functions and mental processes, till the objective world ceases to distract consciousness, till man passes away, fana, nirvana, from phenomenal existence and attains union with the divine. The soul stands self-enlightened, unperturbed by temptations and apprehensions. The members of the Sufistic orders were the bearers of such doctrines and practitioners of this discipline, yoga, dhikr. 4 of these orders were well known in India: Chishtiya, Suravadiya, Naqshbandiya, and Qadiriya. Among them all there appeared, from time to time, men who, by their piety, otherworldliness, asceticism, human kindliness, and abundant love, attracted numerous disciples belonging to all classes and communities. The Chishtiya order, which was established in India by Mu'in al-Din Chishti and counted among its luminaries Qutb al-Din Bakhtiar Kaki, Farid al-Din Ganshakar, Nizam al-Din Auliya, Sheikh Nazir al-Din Chirag, Sayyid Banda Nawaz Gesudaras, and later Sheikh Salim Chishti, were the upholders of the philosophy of absolute monism. They refused to accept any favours from the Delhi kings and extended the hand of friendship toward both Muslims and Hindus. Respect for the susceptibilities of others was an article of faith with the Sufis, for love was their religion. Dad, the Indian mystic poet, says, "Love is the treasury of divine secrets. Love is the music of the divine instrument. Love peoples the abode. Love makes the slave free. Love is the harvest of our existence. Love is our adornment and decoration." Abu Sa'id Abul Khair says, "Faith is one thing and religion of love another. The prophet of love is neither from Iran nor from Arabia." And said Maulana Rumi, "The people of love are different from all the world. The religion and society of lovers is God." Then said Attar, "What is humanity?" And answered himself, "To feel pain at the sorrows of our neighbours, to feel humiliated at the humiliation of fellow beings." They looked upon the rites of religion not as formalities, but as practices of devotion. Again, Attar explains, "Then what is lustration? The purification of the heart. What is purification of the heart? Cleaning of whatever is alien. Fasting is the protection of the heart from its agitations, and then breaking the fast after gaining the vision. What is the pilgrimage to Mecca? Going away from self. Going where? Toward the Creator." It followed that all religions pointed to the same goal. Sanai holds, Unbelief and belief are both marching on his road, while both are saying, "He is one and he has no associates." And Amir Khusrau warned, "O thou that throwest taunts at the Hindu, learn as well from him the way of worship." And Mir Dad declared, "Neither do I lay the foundation of a mosque or a school, nor do I draw the plan of a cloister or a temple. I advise a purpose which is different from unbelief and belief. I rebuild what has fallen to my lot. Heart is the abode which I people." Other poets in India support them. Faizi, who was the poet laureate of Akbar's court, dreams of a new Kaaba and of an edifice without fault. Says he, "Come, let us turn our faces toward the altar of light. Let us lay the foundation of a new Kaaba with stones from Mount Sinai. The walls of the Kaaba have fallen, and the foundations of Qibla have given way. Let us lay the foundation of a faultless edifice." Then says Naziri, "Infidelity of faith are not necessary conditions in love. O Naziri, I can show to thee an infidel who possesses the highest degree of saintliness." And Maghribi says, "I am in wonder why there is enmity between infidelity and belief. Both Kaaba and temple are lighted by the same lamp." And lastly says Akbar, "I am neither in the ranks of unbelievers nor of Mussulmans. I am neither fit for hell nor for heaven. What am I to do?" The mutual give and take, which is the marked characteristic of Hindu and Muslim mystic religion, manifests itself in the fields of language and literature also. The beginning of the modern Indo-Aryan languages coincides with the establishment of Muslim rule in India, and hence it was inevitable that all of them should have absorbed elements from Persian, the language of the Muslims who settled in India. Even Sanskrit had not evaded the infection. In the earlier days, when astronomical works from the Muslim schools of Central Asia came to India, a number of technical terms were borrowed. The same thing happened when under Raja Jai Singh, the Almagest was rendered into Sanskrit from Arabic. Words passed into literature too. Lakshmipati, a Sanskrit poet of the early 18th century, makes use of the following words: Za, Guna, Dil, Kambacht, Sher, Jawab, Wazir, Dushman, Mushtari, Shara, Pil, Kaaba, Mahtab, Ghusl, Halal, Azman, Faramushi, Badasht, Dalil. Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, Punjabi, and other northern Indian languages received with open arms numerous Persian words. In the south, Telugu, and less so the other Dravidian languages, accepted a great many loan words. In other ways, too, the languages were influenced, in grammar, in the formation of compounds, in syntax, also in phonetics. Perhaps the use of rhyming verse, which is not known to Sanskrit, came with Arabic poetry. The influence on the literatures of Indian languages is quite unmistakable. What is remarkable about the Indian languages is the variety and wealth of literature produced in these times. Much the greater proportion of this literature owed its inspiration to religion, and naturally some of the greatest names in literature are those of religious devotees and reformers who belonged to the 16th and 17th centuries. There were, as we have already noticed, a number of religious streams flowing among the people in this age. Each sect had its high priest, who was also an inspired poet. For instance, the greatest advocate of Krishna Bhakti was Surdas, probably a Bhatt, whose name is mentioned by Abul Fazl in the Ain-i-Akbari as a great singer. Next to him were the 8 seals, Ashtakap, of whom Krishnadas, a Sudra, and an eminent poet and scholar, and Nandadas, only second to Surdas as a poet, are justly famous. Outside this group, but in no way inferior to them in devotion to Krishna, was Raz Khan, a Muslim, whose songs express a love and passion amazing in its depth. There were others too, but none of them reached the standard of Sur, Nand, and Raz Khan. Among the promulgators of Ram Bhakti, Tulasidas stands foremost. His lifespan extends between 1532 and 1623. In his line, there were not many outstanding poets. Only Nabadas and Senapati are mentioned as eminent. The third branch of devotees is headed by Kabir, who died at the beginning of the 16th century. He was not only a reformer and a saint, but also a high-class poet. Among those who followed him in this type of devotion to God as the formless spirit was Raidas, a cobbler. There was again a didactic school of poetry which followed both in form and content the example of Sanskrit poetry of this genre. Bhartrihari was their model. Among Hindi moralists, Rahim, who was a Muslim, occupies the highest position. Others include Vrind, Giridhar, and Garg. Another interesting literary tradition was embodied in the romances created by Muslim poets like Malik Muhammad Jayasi, whose story of Padmavat is a fusion of Hindu and Muslim doctrines and ideas. Similar in intent were Manjan's Madhumalati, Usman's Chitravali, Kasin Shah's Hams Jawahar, and so on. There is a ring of sincerity in these poet-saints. They seem to be genuinely concerned in the solution of the problem that their world presented to them. In the preceding age, the great acharyas were occupied with the inner conflicts of the individual belonging to the privileged leisured class. They tried to solve this conflict intellectually by means of complicated arguments involving fine distinctions, razor-sharp logic, and subtle metaphysics. But how were the doubts of the merchant, the artisan, the labourer, the government official, the common soldier, who had neither the time nor the capacity to understand this highbrow philosophy, to be removed? Was conviction a matter of mere intellectual hair-splitting? Were not belief and conviction hard to attain without the involvement of emotion and will? So these godly men abandoned the language and the methods of the learned, reduced to the minimum their physical needs which entangle the mind in sorrow-producing and unsatisfying pursuits, and filled the space emptied of trash with the wealth of ineffable experience. So they garnered a joy and created a love which increased and grew by sharing. They sang of it, and of their trials and tribulations, and their victory over the flesh. The affirmation of their faith found an echo in the hearts of their listeners. But with the turn of the 17th century, the mood began to pass away. The high moral tone receded. Instead, the solicitations of the world, the pleasures of sense, and the carnal love of woman laid siege to the mind. Hindi poetry entered the domain of riti and turned to exploit passion. The Sringa Rasa, the Nakh Sikh delineation, the amorous dalliance varying with seasons, and the virtuoso skill in play upon words unrelated to reality engaged the attention of art. Of this technique, the supreme exponents were Bahirilal, Matiram, Bhushan, Dev, and Rahim, but soon the high tide of their artistry ebbed. This summary review shows how fecund the later Middle Age was in Hindi literature, how it was built up by the genius of both Hindus and Muslims, how in the very front rank stood Muslim writers and poets, Malik Muhammad Jayasi, Ras Khan, Rahim, and Razlin. This is more or less true of the other languages of India also. Punjabi exhibits the same tendencies. The Sikh guru's hymns gave expression to the devotional faith in the one, unseen and formless God. Narrative poems of romantic type were written in abundance, some borrowing their themes from Islamic countries, others from old Indian stories. For example, Yusuf Zulaikha, Shirin Fahad, Layla Majnun, Suleiman Bilkis, Sasi Punu, Hir Ranja, Gopi Chand, Chandabaga, Padmini, Urvase, Tilotama, Sohini, Mahiwal, Madhavanal, Kamkandala, Chandrabadan Mihya, Nal Damayanti, Puran Bhagat, and so on. Among the poets and writers were Waris Shah Mukbil, Hamid, Abdul Hakim, Ahmad Yar, Hashim, as well as Damodar, Budh Singh, Waleram, and so on. Bengali owes much to the enlightened patronage of Muslim rulers for its emergence as a literary language, and many Muslim poets contributed to its treasury. Their poetry is racy of the soil. It demonstrates their identification with Indian traditions. They sing of India's broad and swift rivers, of her multicolored scented flowers, of her twittering birds. The heroes and heroines are Radha and Krishna, Rama and Sita, Arjuna and Draupadi, rather than the famous characters of Arab and Persian tales. Some of them have written Vaishnava songs in which Hindu and Muslim ideas have been fused. On the whole, their creations are inspired with that common culture which the Middle Age was striving to achieve. Sheikh Faizullah was the author of Gaurak Vijaya, which set the fashion for similar biographies including Malada Basu's Sri Krishna Vijaya and Abdus Shakur Mahmud's Gopichanda Sanyas. In the 17th century, Qazi Daulat and Sayyid Alul composed the romances of Sati Mayano O Lo Chandrani and Padamavat. They also wrote Baramasa, Seasons. Sayyid Murtaza's Pad Kalptaru is an anthology of Vaishnava songs in which Sufism is combined with Tantrism. His poem Murali illustrates his attitude. How full of mirth is your flute, O Dark One! No sooner it starts its piercing note than women in every home get ready to rush out like a million moons fallen from the sky. Hidden in your heart lies a jewel of untold value. Take care, the milkmaids may steal in and carry it away. In the guise of Nanda's pampered son, you caper about in public pretending innocence. You have your secret sports under cover of the kadam trees. Little did you reck of our matronly shame, and had your will of us. Stranded do we now lie clasping the river brim. A stranger can never be won over, says Sayyid Murtaza. You have only filled the world with the story of your disgrace. Similarly, Ali Raja's Gayan Sagar is filled with mystic lore and the Sufis' devotion to the religion of love. Says he, there is neither success nor salvation without a training in the technique of love. Every Indian language was a common vehicle for all cultural groups. Each regional language was used by all the inhabitants of the region, Hindus as well as Muslims. Even so, a new literary medium for cultural exchange between the communities had also grown up in the heartland of the empire. Out of the Shauseni Apambrasha of the Midlands, a new Indo-Aryan dialect designated Kari Boli had emerged in and around Delhi. When the Sultanate of Delhi became firmly established, and the strangers from the west had become acclimatized, the association of the Persian-speaking foreigners and Kari Boli-speaking Indians produced a new style of speech which was known as Hindvi or Hindustani, and later christened Urdu, or the language of the royal entourage. Born in Delhi, founded upon the grammar, phonetical system and idiom of Hindi, Urdu borrowed extensively from Persian words, phrases, poetical forms and themes. But within its broad bosom, it gave ample accommodation to Hindu and Muslim traditions, and counted among its votaries persons of all communities. It spread all over India. In the north, its centres were in the Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Bengal, and Gujarat. In the Deccan, it flourished in Aurangabad and Hyderabad, and in the far south in Karnataka and Madras. It had acquired in every sense an all-India character. Its literature first developed in the Deccan, and its pioneers were the Sufis who sought to reach the mind of the people through their own language. Such were Khwaja Banda Nawaz Gesudaraz, Shah Ali Gamdani, Shah Miranji Shamsul Ushak, Shah Burhanuddin Janam, and others. Aminuddin Allah, died 1675, wrote in verse as well as prose. His treatise Risala Mazhabul Salikin on comparative religion demonstrates the unity of Godhead in all religions. Later, numerous poets enriched the literature in Golconda, Bijapur, Aurangabad, and other places. Among them were the crowned sultans of the Qutub Shahi and Adil Shahi dynasties. Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah, 1580 to 1611, was a great linguist. He knew Arabic, Persian, Marathi, Kannada, and Telugu. He was master of Urdu, in which he composed ghazals, qasidas, masnavis, rubais, and masiyas. In the court of these rulers, numerous Urdu poets flourished. What distinguishes the literature that they produced is its dominantly Indian flavour, its naturalness, its simple diction, and its optimistic mood. From the Deccan, the impulses came to the north, and when about the end of the 17th century the Deccan sultanates were extinguished by Aurangzeb, poets migrated, and Delhi welcomed with warmth its child which had by now grown into a lusty youth. The progress of Urdu was rapid, but the times were unpropitious. The Mughal Empire was bleeding to death. In an atmosphere surcharged with despair, frustration, and gloom, and in circumstances threatening the doom of old institutions and ways of life, poetry became the utterance of afflicted hearts and anguished souls. But those who poured out their pain and suffering in Urdu verse were men of genius. So it was that in the sky of murky twilight there shone above the horizon brilliant stars of great magnitude. In this galaxy were Mir Taqi Mir, Mirza Muhammad Rafi Sauda, and Khwaja Mir Dad. Hindus also made a valuable contribution to these developments. Among them Chadraban Brahman, Walirim Wali, Jaswant Rai Munshi, Nawal Rai Wafa, Dayaram Pandit, Sarab Singh Divana, Qub Chand Zaka, and Bidraban Rakim have left their impress upon Urdu poetry. The description of the literature of those times would remain incomplete if I did not say a word about Persian, which was the language of the state for more than 500 years. Though a foreign tongue, Persian borrowed many words from the Indian languages, and Persian poets expressed a deep attachment to their adopted country. Here is a list of words occurring in Persian poetry. Jakar, Urfi, Ramrangi, Talib Amuli, Mahajan, Tamboli, Dobi, Pathani, Champa, Malsiri, Kanwal, Keora, Bira, Pan, Kathal, Rupia, Lach, Tal, Hat, Dashan, Sagar, Ban, Jamdar, Jagraj, Kalim, Paisa, Boti, Dakchauki, Dagla, Tel, Bahal, Kacheri, Bans, Palki, Dupata, Patka, Jogi, Tugura. The list could be multiplied almost indefinitely. The poets wrote about Indian flowers, fruits, animals, birds, customs, and festivals. In Persian, too, Hindu poets and authors showed high skill and great scholarship. Among them Mirza Manohar Tausini, Chandraban, Brahman, Mathura das Hindu, Banwali das Wali, Wamak, Divana, Begum, Amanat and Beda were poets. Bhagwant Das, Hiraman, Bindraban Das, Sujanbir, Narain Kaul Ajiz, Bimsain, Lakshmi Narain Shafak, Birbal Kashru, Kushal Chand, and Rai Chataman were historians. Hakaran, Madhur Ram, Malikzada Munshi, and Munshi Uduraj were letter writers. Rai Anand Ram Mukhlis, Sialkoti Maiwarasta, and Chek Chand Bahar were lexicographers. The arts are the mirror of the culture of a people. Like poetry, painting, architecture, and music express the varying moods, longings, and hopes of a society. In works of art, one finds reflected man's attitudes toward life and toward the world, his vision of reality, his insight into the deepest secrets of his mysterious world, his beliefs regarding the destiny of man and man's relation to the seen and unseen forces which are responsible for the order and chaos prevailing in all creation. Through art, which is the highest manifestation of creative power, man seeks to bring into existence a world of imagination, beauty, and truth, which rivals the world of everyday experience, and seeks to transform it near to his heart's desire. The arts of India of the Middle Ages were the products of a peculiar cooperation of the higher and the lower orders of society. Take, for example, painting. Most of the Mughal emperors were deeply interested in it. They were both patrons and critics, encouraging talent and guiding skill. They invited to their courts great masters from Central Asia and Persia. They gathered the humble but competent practitioners of India. The two worked together, and one was influenced by the other. The result was a style of wondrous beauty. Their miniatures depict equally the gorgeous splendor, the magnificent pageantry of the court with all its solemnity, dignity, and power, as well as the simplicity, asceticism, and serene content of the hermit. They are equally at home in painting scenes of war, chase, and sport, as in the pictures of princes and princesses dallying in marble palaces and enchanting gardens, or watching beautiful damsels dancing or celebrating colourful festivals like Holi, or in painting pictures of women visiting a sadhu, or of men gathered to hear a religious discourse, and of 1,000 other activities of the high and the low. But whatever the subject, the picture is always bathed in clear light. Every detail is rendered with immense care. The ground is carpeted with green, and the trees are in bloom. The mien of the human dwellers in these scenes is one of good cheer. The hearts are elated, heads are held high, and the eyes look straight. The technique is a combination of realism and abstraction. Firm but supple lines individualize every figure. They do not admit of overlapping and confusion. But there is no truck with nature. There is hardly any perspective. Objects appear mostly in the flat, two-dimensional. Faces are full, three-quarters, or in profile, and although full of character and vivacity, they are set over bodies altogether static and mechanically draped and stanced. Line only defines, but colour gives substance to the picture. Thus, although form is abstract, the content is as variegated as the many-hued world. Painting thus reflects the attitude of mind which seeks changelessness in change, abiding joy in the sensuous transience of the space and time continuum. If yoga leads to the integration of personality, art points to the unity which lies behind the multiplicity of nature. It may not be out of place to name some of the painters who evolved the style at the Mughal court which became the prototype of the schools at the courts of provincial governors and of the Hindu Rajas of Rajasthan and the hill states of the Himalayas. Humayun brought with him two pupils of Bizad, namely Mir Said Ali and Khwaja Abdus Samad. Akbar invited Farrukh Kalmak and Akka Raza. But among his artists there were many Hindu painters of great ability like Basavan, Daswant, and Kesho. They were entrusted with the illustration of works like Shahnama, Kamsa-i-Nazami, Baba-nama, Timur-nama, etc., as well as Mahabharata, Ramayana, Nal Damayanti, Panchtantra, and so on. Jahangir carried the art to perfection. He was himself a great connoisseur of art. He has stated in his Tuzuk that he could distinguish between the style of all living and dead painters, and could say who the painter of a particular picture was. He could even differentiate and recognize the line of every painter, and if it was a work of a number of artists, he could declare what part had been drawn by which artist. One of his painters was Mansur, who was an expert in painting birds and flowers. Abul Hassan was given the title of Nadiruz Zaman. Bishandas excelled in portrait painting, and Murad and Manohar were unequalled in drawing. Shah Jahan maintained the high traditions of his father. The great painters of his reign were Muhammad Nadir Samarkandi, Fakirullah Khan, Mir Hashim, Bishandas, and Bichitar. Though the art continued under Aurangzeb, it began to decline rapidly after him. But in the provinces and in the Hindu states, for instance in Jaipur, Kangra, Chamba, and Basoli, it continued to flourish vigorously. Painting is the delicate plant, and architecture the stately tree that adorns the arbour of culture. The Mughal emperors, endowed with an extremely refined taste in the arts, nurtured both with loving care. Babur laid out beautiful gardens with running water, cascading fountains, and marble pavilions. Humayun erected a 7-chambered palace in which each hall was dedicated to one of the 7 planets. Akbar created Fatehpur Sikri with its residential palaces, the Panch Mahal, the hall of worship supported on a central pillar with a 1,000-petaled lotus capital, and the great mosque whose gateway, Buland Darwaza, is unique in the world. Jahangir directed the completion of Akbar's tomb at Sikandara and the Jahangiri Mahal in Agra, and Nur Jahan was responsible for the tomb of her father Itmadud Dowla in Agra. Shah Jahan's contribution to India's architectural monuments is well known. The Red Fort in Delhi with its numerous halls, mansions and mosque, the Jamia Masjid in red sandstone led up to by a magnificent staircase, and above all the incomparable Taj Mahal, are immortal witnesses of his taste. The 3 types of buildings in which the Mughals were mainly interested were palaces, mausoleums, and mosques. The first 2 give monumental expression to their love of life, the palaces to the zest of living a full life in flesh and blood, and the mausoleums to perpetuate themselves in surroundings whose beauty is everlasting. The mosques were, however, the embodiment of reverence and worship in stone. Islam's religious consciousness was moulded in Arabia, and because the deepest convictions of man are embedded in emotions fed by history, tradition, and environment, the Arab experience found its own peculiar forms to express itself. For the Arab, the universe is a great expanse peopled scantily at intervals, but otherwise a void. He looks upward, and the heavens spread to infinity, and the sky is cloudless. As he looks below, the earth as far as the eye can reach is a plain with a few scattered palm trees breaking the vast immensity of glittering particles of sand. God dwells in this universe and beyond. If a tabernacle has to be built which will remind man of the exaltation and majesty of the Lord of creation, surely a dome whose circular surface is boundless and whose curves represent the limitless vault of heavens is the most appropriate form. This pure aesthetic consciousness of the Arab was diluted when Islam spread to countries of Asia, and the Muslims who came to India had their minds formed under different conditions. Thus the mosques they built in India were a compromise or an amalgam of 2 art traditions, one Hindu and the other Iranian Muslim. The Hindu tradition was founded upon the Hindu attitude toward the cosmic problem. Its basic formula was Atma Vai Brahma, the human soul is the absolute. It lays emphasis upon the identity of the individual with the world soul. It admits of no intermediate identity. The individual consciousness is not the national soul nor the human soul. It is the supreme soul. Man is alone with his master. He must commune with God in isolation. Man must therefore create a symbol of this relation, a replica of Brahmanda. This he does in his temple, which has two distinct aspects, one inner represented by the Garbhagriha into which light does not penetrate, and all forms suggestive of multiplicity are blotted out. In this dark, mysterious chamber dwells the spirit, and the worshipper may meditate upon him alone and without distraction. The other aspect of the temple is its exterior, which protects the precious sanctum. But the exterior is the universe, and therefore the temple outside revels in multitudinous form. The platform, the walls, the pillars, the doors, and the shikhara, or spire, are a riot of sculpture and moulding, a veritable forest crowded with life. The Hindu abundance and richness met the Islamic consciousness of unfilled space, and the result was the Indian mosque with roofs provided with bunches of domes and cupolas, pairs of turrets and towers, gates within recessed gates, rows of niches in the walls, multi-cusped arches, stalactites and squinches, stately pillars and capitals, and the effusion of colour through white, black, and multicoloured marble and red stone, and flowing inscriptions engraved on walls and doorways. On the other side, the buildings created during these times show how the Hindu sense of form had absorbed the elements of Muslim architecture. Of this change, the palaces of Man Singh in Gwalior, the temples of Govind Deva and Madan Mohan at Brindaban, the temple of Hamayadeva at Govardhan, the Jain temples of Sonagar in Bundelkhand, the palaces and pavilions built in Vijayanagar, Chandragiri, Madura, Tanjore, and Rajputana by Hindu rulers are some illustrations. Unfortunately, the line of these enlightened, large-hearted, generous humanists began to shrivel as the 17th century advanced towards its close. The élan vital, which had sustained the extraordinary efflorescence of genius, began to wane. Reaction, fed by growing forces of confusion and anarchy, raised its ugly head. Devotional faith receded into the background. Blind bigotry, chilling frustration, and dark pessimism laid hold of the minds of men. The 18th century saw a divided and unhappy India move toward the climacteric of its downfall. Plassey set the seal upon that phase of our culture which had grown and developed during the later Middle Ages. With the British conquest of Bengal, a new chapter in Indian history began. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.